عنا خط بكتابك بترحيبه لو سرابك ليلك وجنة بالدجا في الليل تسريبه.
واسأل عنا له المنة قل علامات انت تدريبه. مدعيكم غايب عنا والحكم ميوز في الغيبة. ينبغي الإنسان يتأنى ويحكم بأحكام مصيبة. لا تحس بالحيف ذا منا النصف ناخذ ونعطيبه. سوي يميل وبلغه عنا بالسلام وألف ترحيب.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. As is the sunnah when we start any gathering, we praise Allah Azza wa Jal and we send salutations and peace upon His noble messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And we know that when we don't do this, any gathering is devoid of barakah. And we live in times where we need plenty of barakah. Those of you who've been following the news recently will know that in Syria, 2-3 days ago, a massacre happened in Al-Qubayl village, where up to 90 people were killed, men, women and children. And some were beaten, some were shot, some were burnt to death by Assad's personal forces. The latest news that came in about 4 hours ago says that another massacre happened in the south of the country, where 20 people were killed. And it's unfortunate that in this political context, we're discussing the life of a great companion. This political companion, the Sahabi, radhiyallahu anhu, is the Sahabi whom Umar ibn al-As said about him, he's the master of war, he's a friend of death, and he fights like a lion. The most famous statement about him from Abu Bakr, radhiyallahu anhu, he said that women would never be able to give birth to a man like Khalid ibn Waleed.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So inshallah, we'll spend the next half an hour or so talking about the life of Khalid ibn Waleed. His name, Khalid ibn Waleed, is very famous. In fact, these stories, I remember my wife tells me that she was read these stories as a child growing up by her mother. There was an Urdu book written all about the life of Khalid ibn Waleed. It's something that's well known, this person, but sometimes the context is missing, or sometimes the relevance to the day is missing. So I just want to focus on some of the aspects of Khalid ibn Waleed's life. It wouldn't be possible to cover his whole entire lifespan and all of its details in a short talk like this. So we're going to skip some of those aspects, which, you know, they go into long, lengthy details about some of the battles. But still I want to bring out the most, you know, so a good picture of what his life was like, inshallah, so we can have a good taste of how the life of this noble Sahaba was. So his name, Abu Sulaiman, is the father of Sulaiman, his oldest son Sulaiman, Khalid ibn al-Waleed. And he's the son of the leader of Quraysh, Walid ibn al-Mughira. So the Walid in his name comes from his father, who is Walid ibn al-Mughira, one of the worst enemies of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, and one of the staunchest people opposing Islam when it began. When Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam was sent the bi'atha, the prophethood, and he became a Rasul. He was also the cousin of Abu Jahl, also known as the harshest and the hardest of the enemies against Islam in the time of Quraysh. He was a best friend of Ikramah, who was the son of Abu Jahl. And you find that Khalid ibn al-Waleed, his whole family, they were in some way involved in his opposition to Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. They were the nobles of Quraysh. And it's important to understand something about the nobility or the structure of Quraysh to understand how Khalid ibn Waleed was raised. He was raised in this environment. And when his father heard, when Rasulullah ﷺ first announced that he had become a prophet and he'd been sent the angel Jibreel alayhi salam, then Khalid's father, Waleed, his first reaction was, is this prophethood to be bestowed on Muhammad while I, the greatest of the Quraysh and their elder, am to get nothing? This was the reaction, this was the attitude. He believed he was from the nobles, and he believed that he would deserve this honor, and he did not deserve to go to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was still a noble, but not as noble or from a lineage as noble in rank as Waleed believed about his own family. This is a society and a family that believed rank and nobility was everything. Your family lineage defined the whole thing to you. So it was very important. But in order to understand his environment a little more, we need to look at the person of the father of Khalid to understand a little bit about who was Khalid. So just one example from Waleed ibn al-Mughira's infrications and altercations with Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, is that he came to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam and he said, "Ya Muhammad, هذا الأمر الذي جئت به فرقنا قومنا وسفهت أبانا وسببت آلهتنا." He says, "Oh Muhammad," he came to Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam and he said, "Oh Muhammad, this thing you've brought to us, it has divided our tribes, our families, our people. You have insulted our gods, and you've mocked, you've made stupid our fathers, our forefathers." And then the conversation continued, and he was saying, if it's nobility you want, we'll give you nobility. If it's money you want, we'll give you money. If it's an illness you have, we'll find the best doctors to cure you. If it's position you want, we'll give you position. If it's women you want, we'll give you women, and so on and so on. Kept offering him many things. Until finally Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, "Afaragt? Have you finished?" And then he started to reply. So Waleed ibn al-Mughira said, "Yes, I've finished. I've said what I have to say." And so Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam's reply was, "Hamim, tanzilun min ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, kitabun fussilat ayatuhu Qur'anan Arabiyyan liqawmin ya'lamun, bashirun wa nadhirun fa'a'rada aktharuhum fahum la yasma'un." So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam started reciting Qur'an to him. Hamim, this is a revelation from ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is the book in which is detailed ayahs, an Arabic Qur'an for people who know, for the people who know and think. Bashirun wa nadhirun, so it's a warner and glad tidings. But most of them reject it because they don't listen. And this ayah continued and he started criticizing those who had disbelieved. Until Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam came to the ayah, فَإِنْ أَعْرَضُوا فَقُلْ أَنذَرْتُكُمْ صَاعِقَةً مِثْلَ صَاعِقَةِ عَادٍ وَثَمُودٍ. At this point, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam arrived at the ayah 12 and says, if they reject, then I bring you, then say to them, I have warned you, and I'll bring you destruction like the destruction of Ad and Thamud. And at this point, Waleed ibn al-Mughira became afraid, because now he was threatening with what he'd known the Ad and Thamud, the previous tribes before, had been destroyed with. And this was a story well known to the Arabs. So now Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was threatening the leader of the Quraysh, the father of Khalid ibn Waleed, that he's going to destroy them just as Ad and Thamud had been destroyed. And so Waleed ibn al-Mughira started pleading for forgiveness, for mercy, begging for mercy at this point, because he realized the significance of what he had said. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam continued reciting until he reached the sajda, and then he said, "Hada ma indi." That's what my reply is. That's what I've got for you. So this was the confrontation that was happening with Waleed's father. Waleed, the father of Khalid ibn al-Waleed, and it gives you an understanding of the environment, the cousins, the uncles, the fathers, the grandfathers. Everybody in Khalid's family was opposed to Islam. In fact, Khalid's father Waleed was so oppositional to Islam that he even offered the brother of Khalid, Ammara, the son, his favorite son, and the most handsome and the most desirable of the Arab young men at the time, because he was from nobility and he had all the good qualities that any father was looking for in his son. He said, "I'll give you to Abu Talib." He said, "I'll give you my son, and you just give me your son. You give me your nephew Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was being brought up as a son. And we will kill him, and you will look after, and you can call Ammara your son. And we will all consider him to be your son." Of course, Abu Talib rejected this. He said, "This isn't fair." He says, "I give you my son, you kill him, or I give you my nephew and you kill him, and you give me your son, I feed him, I look after him." And where's the fairness in that? So he rejected that plan. But this was one of the many attempts that Waleed ibn al-Mughira was making in order to get back to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and try to prevent the harm that he was causing in Quraysh. But this was the situation that Khalid bin al-Waleed grew up in. And so in this environment, what mattered to Khalid ibn al-Waleed? He lived a life of luxury. He was a son of the chief of the nobles. And so he was involved in sports. He wasn't really a worker. If he was working as a blacksmith making swords, his own swords which he would use in battles. He was trained on all of the military arts. He was trained on how to be a general. So he was being raised in nobility. And we don't know an awful lot about what actually happened with Khalid ibn Waleed and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Makkah. There's not much recording of the details. So we can't go into details, but we can understand a lot from the background. And understand a lot from the company he kept. Ikramah, his best friend, was the son of Abu Jahl, and Abu Jahl was the one who used to chase Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the market and oppose him. Also, Umar ibn al-Khattab was a contemporary of Khalid ibn Waleed, and he said they actually looked very similar. They were similar in build, in stature, and therefore they were natural rivals. So there was a certain rivalry amongst them, particularly between their tribal family origins, but also personally between the two of them in the early days of Makkah. Anyway, this continued until the persecution. This isn't a story about the life of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but of course we need to understand the environment of Makkah just to see the place where Khalid grew up in. So he was involved in many business trips, traveling to Syria, traveling to Iraq, carrying out the business of his father, the caravans who would bring the trade back and forth. He wasn't a particularly religious person. He had no attachment to the idols, although that was part of his culture and his heritage. It was part of the wealth and it was part of the business of the Quraysh that they were the keepers of the Kaaba, and therefore if you insulted the gods and somehow did harm to the gods, you were doing harm to the whole revenue stream for Quraysh. So that was an issue that Khalid ibn al-Waleed would have been aware of, and hence part of his opposition to Islam would have been based upon, you're affecting our livelihood. In any case, Rasulullah ﷺ and the Muslims left Makkah, they moved to Medina, to Yathrib, it became Medina, and then the battles between the Muslims started. And this is where Khalid's life begins as far as we're concerned. This is where the history books start recording Khalid ibn al-Waleed. Although the first battle, Badr, was not attended by Khalid because he was travelling at the time in Syria, I believe, in one of the caravans. So he wasn't present at Badr, but he was certainly affected by it. Because his cousin Abu Jahl was killed there. Actually 70 of Quraysh were killed and 70 of Quraysh were captured. 17 of those Quraysh were from the family, the close family, nephews and cousins of Khalid ibn al-Waleed. So he was definitely affected. And his own brother Waleed was also captured by the Muslims and held prisoner at Badr and taken back to Medina. So Abu Sufyan, who became the leader of Quraysh after Badr, because Abu Lahab and Abu Jahl both died around the incidences of Badr. Abu Jahl in the battle was killed, and Abu Lahab died when he heard about the news of the defeat of Badr. So Abu Sufyan became the leader, and he ordered the Quraysh, there will be no grieving. We need to preserve this feeling of anger so that we can take revenge against the Muslims next year. So they had planned next year they're going to attack. Uhud had been started planning from the first moment of the defeat of Badr. And in this environment he also said, do not free any of the slaves. Okay, we don't want to spend our money for any slaves. We need to keep this anger and this feeling of revenge. But Khalid ibn al-Waleed and his brother Hisham could not leave their brother Waleed as a captive for the whole year. So they decided to travel to Medina against the wishes of Abu Sufyan, and they did free their brother for 4,000 dirhams. And then when they were leaving Medina, they camped the night at Dhul Hulayfa, the place where we put ihram on when we're coming from Medina to Makkah. That same place, they camped the night there. And during the night, Waleed escaped from his brothers, who had just freed him for 4,000 dirhams. He went back to Medina, met the Prophet ﷺ, and said he shahada and became Muslim. And he lived there. Then he became one of the noble and one of the best and well-known Muslims, and one of the most pious of Muslims, beloved to Rasulullah ﷺ. And this, of course, affected Khalid ibn al-Waleed, because he was still close to his brother. They had gone to all that effort to release him, yet he still became Muslim. This is going to affect Khalid. It didn't mean that he became Muslim immediately, not at all. But the good relations he kept with his brother meant there was an avenue for the dawah still to continue. There was a kind of an emotional and moral pressure on Khalid ibn al-Waleed. Anyway, the events continue. Then we arrive at Uhud. And this is the first time when Khalid made a name for himself. He had not actually led a battle. He had not really fought in a battle up to this point. But he'd been trained in the art of war. And because he was one of the nobles, naturally he was one of the leaders. Abu Sufyan was the real leader of the army at Uhud. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam had positioned the fighters, the Muslim army, in such a position that their backs were to Uhud and they were facing Medina. And he positioned around 40 archers on top of a small mountain called Aynain, which we now call Jabal al-Ramah, the mountain or the hill of the archers. And it's a famous place right next to the grave of Hamza radiallahu anhu and the Shuhada of Uhud. Anyway, they were on top of there with, I think it was Abdullah ibn Jubair, with 40 archers. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam had given them very strict orders. He said, use your arrows against the enemy cavalry. Keep the cavalry off our backs. As long as you hold your positions, our rear is safe. On no account must you leave this position. If you see us winning, do not join us. If you see us losing, do not come to help us. Explicit, very clear order from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. But despite that clarity of the order, the Muslims were able to create chaos amongst the Quraysh camp to the point they started to plunder and take all the war booty, the fay, the anfal of the spoils of the war, of the battle. So Quraysh were in disarray and started to escape the battlefield. For some reason, Khalid ibn Waleed, who was leader of one part of the cavalry, and Ikramah, they stayed, remained patient, waiting. We don't know why they were remaining patient, but as a result of their patience, it paid off. Because when the fighters, the archers on the mountain, they saw the Muslims were winning, an argument ensued between them, and they decided that they would go and start to take some of the spoils of the war as well. So they left the mountain. And in fact, Abdullah ibn Jubair and only 7 of the archers were left. And Khalid ibn al-Waleed, he saw this. So because he was trained in the art of war, he knew that this was an opportunity. So he saw the opportunity and he attacked the archers. He came onto the mountain and he mounted in his horses, and he was able to fight and kill them, including Abdullah ibn Jubair. And this left open the back, the flank, the side of the Muslims. There was nobody guarding the Muslims from behind. So Khalid and Ikramah, who saw what was going on, then took their army round the back and were able to kind of surround the Muslims and catch them off guard, which then caused chaos in the Muslim camp, to such an extent that many of the Muslims started to flee and escape from Uhud. And to cut a long story short, they took refuge in the mountain of Uhud itself. Rasulullah ﷺ was badly injured, but still he was able to position himself in such a position that after making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the enemy would not be able to catch them. And Khalid ibn Waleed, he was able to chase and pursue Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam until he realized that he actually had a better strategic position, and the battle was over. And so that was the end of Uhud, and the Quraysh went back. But Khalid made a name for himself there, because he inflicted a heavy wound on Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's army. And actually, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had impressed Khalid at this point, because in so doing, in the way he had arranged the strategy of Uhud, he had made sure that the strength of the Muslims, which had no cavalry, and hand-to-hand combat was their real strength, was to their full advantage. And the strength of the Quraysh, which was cavalry, had no advantage because of the positioning and because of the archers on the hill. So to a strategic mind, this was an excellent strategy, and Khalid really appreciated that point. In any case, 70 Muslims had fallen at Uhud, and this was considered a recompense for those who had died at Badr. But despite that, Abu Sufyan threatened and promised to come back the next year to Badr. And Khalid ibn al-Waleed was one of the leaders again of that battle. They set out the next year to Badr again to meet the Muslims who were actually waiting for them at Badr at the time. And then Abu Sufyan turned back. He made an excuse. He said, this is not a good year. It's been a dry year. We've not had good crops. This is not the year for fighting. We'll fight next year. And so they turned around and went back home. Again, Khalid was being led by Abu Sufyan, but he's seeing this. He's seeing the resolve of Quraysh. Their heart's not really in it. What are they fighting for if they can just turn back from this mission so quickly? Yet the Muslims, they stayed there, they camped there for 8 days before they went back waiting. The battles continued. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was attacked again in Medina, the Battle of the Trench, Al-Khandaq. Khalid ibn al-Waleed was one of the few who managed to cross the Khandaq, the trench, and enter into the Muslim camp, but he was fought off and he had to escape, and so he didn't succeed. And then, of course, the storm came and all of Quraysh escaped again. Frustrating for a military person like Khalid. He's not able to get his teeth into any real battles. He's always losing the battles that he's in. He's never part of anything substantial, and the Muslims are always doing something, and that's where, frankly, all the fun was. All of the fighting was taking place. Hudaybiyah, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent 1,400 Muslims to make pilgrimage, to make Hajj in Hudaybiyah, I think Umrah rather. They meant to make Umrah, but yet they were stopped. Khalid ibn Waleed went to stop them on the way, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam again was able to outmaneuver, outflank Khalid ibn Waleed. He didn't meet the army, there was no confrontation, and yet again they camped at Hudaybiyah and a peace treaty was made. This peace treaty meant that now there was no more hostility between Quraysh, the people of Khalid, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam for a period of 10 years. That was the written treaty with many conditions in it. But what this did, this meant that Khalid was able, it meant two things. It meant Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was able to concentrate on the north, was able to send his troops throughout Arabia and fight in many more battles. In fact, there was 28 more battles after Hudaybiyah that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was involved in, either himself or the Muslims. And Khalid was watching all of this. And he was able to see what was going on in Medina. And so it gave him an opportunity to think as well. Because he wasn't so much directly involved now in the fighting, but he was able to sit back and reflect on what was happening with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why were we opposing him? And as I said, he wasn't particularly religious. He wasn't defending the honor of the gods of the Kaaba or anything like this. He was more defending the honor of his family, revenge, and actually, frankly, he just wanted to be involved in the fight as a military person. And then he started to think. And then he met Ikramah, his friend, and he told him, it is evident to the intelligent mind that Muhammad is neither a poet nor a sorcerer as the Quraysh allege. His message is truly divine, and it is incumbent on all sensible men to follow him. So Ikramah, his friend, who was of course the son of Abu Jahl, was stunned, and he said, are you now abandoning your faith? If you do that, I won't speak to you until you come back. I'll never speak to you again, he said. And he said, why is it? It's so strange that you of all people from Quraysh should say that. So Khalid asked why. He said, because so many of your family have been dishonored, have been killed and attacked by Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, by Muhammad. And then Khalid replied, that was from the days of ignorance. It was from ignorance that we wanted revenge. It wasn't from understanding his message. So when Abu Sufyan came to hear of the Khalid, of what he had said to Ikramah, and how he had said basically he wants to become a Muslim. So he came to him and asked him, is it true? And Khalid said, yes, and why not? After all, if he is not one of us, is he not one of the people of our tribe? So Abu Sufyan flew off in a rage. He became so angry and started abusing Khalid, to the point that Ikramah said to Abu Sufyan, with your anger, such anger that I see from you is likely to make me turn into a Muslim and go and join Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It caused a rift in Quraysh. Anyway, that night, Khalid ibn Waleed, he took his armor, he made up his mind, he travelled to Medina. And on his way, coincidentally, he met Amr ibn al-As and he met Uthman bin Talha. Also, two of the generals, two of the leaders from noble families of Quraysh had also had a similar mindset and wanted to join Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and start to fight under his banner rather than that of Quraysh. So all of them went to Medina together, met the Prophet ﷺ, said their shahada and were welcomed. And they were welcomed even though they were the ones who had killed many Muslims in the past. Even though they were the sworn enemies of Islam up to that point. But they were welcomed by the Muslims. They were not seen as on the high ranks of Abu Bakr, of Uthman radiallahu anhu, of Umar al-Khattab. They were not the earliest of Muslims. This was the 8th year of Hijrah, before they had converted to Islam. But still they had converted, and they were welcomed by the Muslims in Medina. So this was a warming thing to them. And Rasulullah ﷺ started to invite Khalid to sit with him, and he became a close companion to learn from Rasulullah ﷺ. And it was when Rasulullah ﷺ sent a mission to Mutta that Khalid first saw his action of a military general under Rasulullah ﷺ. It was because he wasn't appointed the leader of the army at first. Initially, Zayd bin Harith was appointed the leader of the army. And then if he fell, it was Ja'far bin Abi Talib. And if he fell, it was Abdullah bin Rawaha. And if he fell, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, then let the Muslims appoint someone from them who they all agree upon. And so the battle ensued, and it was a big battle. 100,000 of the Romans were meeting a small force of the Muslims. And the Muslims, frankly, were not prepared for such a force. But Abdullah bin Rawaha, he gathered them all and said, "Men fight not with numbers or weapons, but they fight with their iman. By going into battle, we have a choice of two glorious alternatives, victory or martyrdom." And this convinced the Muslims to go ahead. So they did, and they fought valiantly. And it was never really a battle that was to be won. It was more a battle for the honor, because they were defending the honor of the Muslims who had been murdered by the tribes around Mutta. So all three of the leaders were killed until the standard was lying on the floor. Then Thabit bin Arqam, he lifted up the Muslim banner, the standard, and he started shouting, "Oh Muslims, choose somebody to be the leader who can carry this forward." So he saw Khalid and said, "You should take it." And Khalid said, "I'm not worthy. You're more worthy than me." Meaning, you've been a Muslim longer than me. I was, until recently, an enemy of Islam. I'm not the person to lead the Muslims into battle. But then Thabit replied, "You are more deserving. There's nobody but you." And so that's it. Khalid took it. He then arranged the army in a different way. He then arranged a full frontal attack against these 100,000 of the Roman warriors. He didn't defeat them, but he put them off guard. They were now on the back foot. They had to retreat from the battlefield somewhat. And that was the opportunity for the Muslims to turn around and come back to Medina. So he managed to make a tactical withdrawal after a punishing attack against the Romans. And this is the first time the Muslims had ever returned from the battlefield without actually holding the battlefield. And so when the army returned back, many of the Muslims of Medina started to take the dust and the stones from the ground and throw it in the faces of the soldiers and said, "You've run, you've fled from Allah's victory, you fled from Allah's jihad." And so they started to insult them. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he saw this and he raised his voice. He said, "They have not fled." He said, "They have not fled, they shall return to fight inshallah." So he protected the Muslims and he said, this is not a shameful thing they've done. He actually confirmed what Khalid did was the right thing to do. And then he said something even more strange. He said, "Khalid is the sword of Allah." He said, "What an excellent slave of Allah, Khalid bin Waleed. One of the swords of Allah unleashed against the unbelievers. Unleashed against the mushrikeen." So this was where Khalid bin Waleed, he took the name from, Sayfullah, the sword of Allah. And this name stuck. From this point on, Khalid bin Waleed, he was now one of the leaders, one of the generals of the Muslim army. And from this point on, he would never ever lose a battle. And that's only ever been said about two generals in the entire history of humanity. Genghis Khan and Khalid ibn Waleed. The only two generals who've never ever lost a battle. And Khalid ibn Waleed, of course, was merciful at the end of the battle, to the point that he did not destroy. He accepted the jizya once they had decided to give up. Genghis Khan, when he came, he only destroyed and left nothing but annihilation in his wake. So Khalid ibn Waleed is without a doubt the greatest general the world has ever seen. In any case, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam fought one or two other battles before he passed away, alayhi salatu wasalam, and Khalid bin Waleed was involved and he was sent on missions and battles and so on and so forth to lead expeditions and battalions on behalf of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then after that, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu became the Khalifa, and immediately became what's known as the Hurub al-Ridda, which is where many apostates turned around against Islam. Frankly, what happened was some of the leaders of the Arab tribes turned around and said, "We are prophets too." And so their tribes followed them and said, "We're following this prophet now instead of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because he's no longer around." So you had Aswad, you had Musaylima, you had a number of women prophets and so on and so forth, all standing up falsely claiming to be prophets. So Abu Bakr declared war on all of them, and they inflicted such heavy punishment against Muslims, true Muslims, these apostates did, that Abu Bakr turned around and said, in the same way that the apostates had killed the Muslims, we will kill them back. So if they burnt them, we will burn them. If they crucified us, we will crucify them. If they killed us, we will kill them, and so on. So Khalid bin Waleed was sent off and tasked with this task of leading the armies, one of the armies, not all of the armies of course, against many of the different tribes. So he gained a name for himself against these apostate tribes. And he also gained a reputation. In fact, Khalid ibn Waleed is not only known for his bravery and his strength and his prowess at being a great general, he's also famous for a few mistakes that he made. There are times when he did actions which they caused many of the Sahaba to question what is going on. They were worried, is he acting for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is he acting out of his own revenge? So one place, Al-Ghumaysa, he actually, even though the people had said they reverted back to Islam, he still slaughtered them anyway. And this was something that Ibn Umar and Abu Qatada did not agree with, and they complained to Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And and they complained. And, sorry, my mistake, this was actually, I've mixed up the stories there. That was actually an incident that took place in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But still, Khalid went into a tribe and he did actually slaughter some people who even after they had said their shahada. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, I'm innocent of what Khalid has done. He said to Allah, I'm innocent of what Khalid has done. And Rasulullah, an argument ensued between Khalid ibn Waleed and some of the Sahaba over this issue. Until Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam replied to Khalid, he said, leave my companions alone, O Khalid. If you possessed a mountain of gold and spent it in the way of Allah, you would not achieve the status of any of my companions. So there was this education still going on with Khalid to make sure that all of his fighting was purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, we cannot look into the intentions of these incidents, but the reality was Khalid was no saint. We're not claiming him to be a saint. But however, he was sincere in his fight for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that was proven time and time again afterwards throughout the rest of his history. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam kept on approving of him and kept on sending him out as a leader of the army and kept on insisting that what he was doing was right, even though there was a few mistakes. So this then led into the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And again there was many battles in which Khalid ibn Waleed led, and he took the initiative. And there was even a little kind of rivalry and conflict between him and Umar bin al-Khattab. Abu Bakr was the Khalifa at the time, but Umar, he was the advisor to the Khalifa. He was second in command. He was the second most sincere of all the companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So each time he heard of one of the exploits of Khalid, he was always saying to Abu Bakr, restrain him, bring him back, punish him for what he has done. But Abu Bakr would always defend him. He would say, he was only following my orders. What he did was what I ordered him to do. He has not transgressed. So Abu Bakr was his biggest defender, and Umar was the one who was actually arguing against Khalid ibn Waleed at the time. And then finally Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he said, Umar, keep your tongue off of Khalid. I shall not sheathe the sword that Allah has drawn against the mushrikeen. This was Abu Bakr's point. He saw that in Khalid was something that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw, and for that reason he had given him the name Sword of Allah. He of course was the closest of all the companions to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Abu Bakr that is. And he saw that there was a reason why Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam had chosen Khalid this title and made him the general. And Abu Bakr said, I'm not the one who's going to, bring down the general that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself had appointed. So from this basis, Khalid kept continuing and continuing. And it was good that he did. Abu Bakr saw something in him, which Umar bin al-Khattab later he said, even after all of their arguments and rows, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, Umar bin al-Khattab said, he says, praise be to Allah, and may He have mercy on Abu Bakr. He was a better judge in character than I was. This is a good compliment from Umar bin al-Khattab. He was a better judge of character than I was. Because actually it was Umar bin al-Khattab, when he became Khalifa, who removed Khalid ibn Waleed from being the leader of the Muslims army. He was the one who put him second, not even second, he put him a fighter under Abu Ubaidullah ibn al-Jarrah. He was the one who put him as a second, in the army. But in reality, Ubaidullah would always consult with Khalid ibn al-Waleed. And so in reality, Khalid was still effectively designing all the strategies for the army until Umar bin al-Khattab finally removed him from the army altogether. So this rivalry continued throughout the life of Umar bin al-Khattab and Khalid ibn al-Waleed. But they did in the end manage to earn mutual respect for each other and resolve their differences. So it's important just to see there was a context that Umar bin al-Khattab was a different person to Abu Bakr, and in the end he actually regretted what he had done to Khalid. In any case, there was a number of battles, and you know, unfortunately, I'm not having the time. Maybe a little later we can talk about some of the extra incidences. But there was a time when Khalid ibn Waleed was sent to Al-Yamama to fight against the apostates, Musaylima the liar, and there was only a few left of the army after this, because Abu Bakr, after Musaylima had been killed by Khalid, then it was actually Wahshi, the same person who killed Hamza radiallahu anhu, was actually who had become Muslim later, actually killed with the same spear Musaylima al-Kadhab, the liar. But it was under the leadership of Khalid ibn Waleed. At the end of this battle, Abu Bakr sent a letter to Khalid saying, now turn your attention to the Persians. I want you to go to Hira, which was the capital of the Persians. I want you to take all of that land. So this became the new objective. But he knew that this was now a jihad which was offensive. He was not defending against the Harub al-Rida, against the apostates anymore. He was now offensively attacking and trying to expand the borders of the Muslim lands. So he made it voluntary. He said, do not impose upon any of the soldiers. And at that, Khalid ibn Waleed was left with only 2,000 fighters. And so he was left with a pitiful force in order to take on the whole of the Persian army. So he sent a letter to Abu Bakr saying, send reinforcements, I need more people. Raise me an army. Well, at this, Abu Bakr was stretched on all fronts. He didn't have people. So he sent one man, Ka'ka' bin Amr, who was one of the people that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had said, if a man like Ka'ka', if he's in your army, you cannot lose. So he sent one man as reinforcement to Khalid ibn al-Waleed. But that was enough. When people heard the story of Ka'ka', it was in the army of Khalid. So you had the Khalid, the general who could not lose, and you had Ka'ka', the soldier who could not lose in the same army. The people started to gather until they managed to gather 18,000 Muslim soldiers to fight against the Persians. And that was the largest of any Muslim army had ever seen at that time. So in any case, the battles against the Persians are long and drawn out, and there are many battles. There are many famous battles. Khalid made a name for himself in these battles. But the name he made was, again, the general who could not lose. He kept on winning after winning after winning, showing his bravery. He would have hand-to-hand combat with the generals. And often he would kill the general without the fight even taking place. Often he was able to take the leaders because he was fighting them, you know, in hand-to-hand combat or just sword-to-sword combat in front of the armies before the main armies clashed. In one of these incidences, he was tricked by the Persian general at the time. He had implied that we will have a fair fight, and whoever wins we will fight man to man. But actually, the Persian had brought 10 of his warriors along to protect him in order to ambush Khalid. But it was Ka'ka' bin Amr who saved Khalid on that day and came along and slaughtered the 10 on his own, and then Khalid himself was saved. But Khalid, in all of these, he was taking wounds over his whole body. When he actually died, Khalid ibn Waleed, on his deathbed, about another 10 years later, he didn't die in the battlefield. He died an old man, and he died of a sickness. But on that time, he showed a friend his body, and he said, look at my leg, can you see even a handspan where there is not a wound? And his friend said no. He said, look at my other leg, look at my chest, and he showed him different parts of his body. There was no part that had not been wounded by a stabbing or something, a cut, a graze of some kind all over his body. And then Khalid said, why is it that I have these wounds, all of them in the path of Allah, and Allah has not taken me as a martyr to die on the battlefield with honor. And yet I die here as a sick old man in my bed. And his friend explained to him that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he named you the sword of Allah, he was deciding that you can never die on the battlefield. You would never be able to die on the battlefield. Because the sword of Allah has been drawn against the mushrikeen. If you were killed on the battlefield by one of the unbelievers, the mushrikeen, then it would be that the sword of Allah has been broken by a mushrik, and that could never be the case. Allah's sword itself has been broken. So therefore, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has decided for you that you would die not on the battlefield. So this was the status of Khalid. But he was so brave that he kept on continuously. So the people had asked what the success of Khalid ibn Waleed was. what is the secret behind Khalid ibn Waleed's great victories? And there was one battle, I'm skipping a few battles now. He took Persia effectively. There were many incidences which we can maybe mention a few later. Then he turned his attention to Sham. He was ordered, now go to Damascus, now go to Sham. He fought the Romans. He continued pushing in, pushing in. He was the one who besieged Damascus and jumped over the wall and was able to free it, even though, again, a trick had taken place and actually they were not able to end it with a fight. It was ended in a peace truce. He was the one who besieged Al-Quds, and then initially he was sent to pretend to be Umar bin al-Khattab to sign the peace treaty with the patriarch of Al-Quds. But they knew it wasn't Umar al-Khattab. And then the real Umar came. The real Umar came and he signed the peace treaty. This was Khalid ibn al-Waleed, was involved in all of these battles. Until the final battle, which was the greatest battle of Khalid ibn al-Waleed, was Yarmouk, which was the most decisive battle against the Muslims and the Christians of that period and possibly of all time. It's the defining moment in the end of the Roman Empire. And it was where 200,000 or more, we don't know the exact numbers, but 100 or 200,000 of the Romans met the Muslims, and ultimately they were completely defeated. But the Muslims, because of their stratagem, they will keep on, and because Khalid was actually leading again the battle at this time, they kept on moving forward, imposing strikes against the disbelievers, until finally 35,000 were killed on the battlefield, 35,000 were pushed off of a cliff. That was the end of the battle. But in the middle of this, Khalid became worried. And the Muslims had never seen Khalid worried before. Why is Khalid being worried? He was searching around, he was frantic, he was panicking. And Khalid had never panicked before. In this battle, he was looking for something. He said, where is my red cap? Has anybody seen my red cap? Under his armor, under his helmet, under his turban, he wore a small red cap. And they were looking for it. And eventually they found it. He was not worried and he went on and won the battle again, of course. This red cap was actually the secret of Khalid ibn al-Waleed. The secret was that Khalid, he was present at the last of the pilgrimage, the last Hajj of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So after the Hajj, of course, we all cut our hair. So when Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasallam shaved his head, Khalid picked up some of the hairs of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasallam said to him, what are you going to do with those hairs, O Khalid? And Khalid said, with these I will gain strength against our enemies in my battles. And so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, if you keep them with you, you will never lose a battle. So this was the promise of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so because of this, Khalid, he had them woven into this cap, so they would always become part of it, and he never took that cap off when he was in battle. In fact, he was asked about what his secret was, because the mushrikeen had misunderstood what the secret of Khalid ibn al-Waleed was in all this time. At the beginning of this battle of Yarmouk, just before the Muslims were about to clash, one of the generals of the Christian generals came out and he met and he called for Khalid. So Khalid thought he was being brought out for a duel. So he met them face to face, but this general didn't draw his sword. And he started to ask Khalid some questions. He said, tell the truth, for a free man and a noble man never lies. So Khalid said, okay, I'll tell the truth. He said, tell me, is it true that your prophet sent a sword from the heavens down to you, and for that you are known, and you can never lose a battle with that sword, and for that you are known as the sword of Allah? So Khalid laughed and said, no, that's not true. He said, then why is it that you are known as the sword of Allah? So Khalid explained to him the story, how he got his name, from way back in the Battle of Mu'tah, all those years ago. So then this general, George his name was, he continued to ask some questions. He said, so what is it you're inviting us to? He said, to say the Shahada, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. And he said, well, what if I don't say that? He said, then you can pay the jizya. And what if I don't pay that? He said, then there is only the sword and we will fight you. And so then the general, he continued to think and ponder. He said, what is the status of somebody who enters your deen today, on this battlefield today? And then Khalid replied, the same status as all of us. There's only one status. We are all one. We don't have ranks amongst the Muslims. And so at this point, George, he then said his shahada, he said, I'm going to enter your deen. And he went back with Khalid ibn al-Waleed back to the army, and then he said his shahada, he turned around and he started fighting against the army that he was leading at the beginning of the day. He turned around and he was martyred in that battle. So this was the life, a very brief summary of the life of Khalid ibn al-Waleed. And I covered just a few of the basic stories, and there are many stories, details about the battles. interesting incidences, funny incidences even, that happened in the life of Khalid. But I wasn't able to cover all of them. But finally, as I said already, Khalid ibn Waleed, he didn't understand. He died without understanding or without fully appreciating the significance of his title, Sayf Allah. It wasn't clear in his mind. And so for that, he was somewhat distressed when he died off of the battlefield. But as his friend had tried to console him and explain to him, the sword of Allah could never be broken. And it is true, the sword of Allah was never broken and it never lost a battle in the name of Islam in his whole life. It didn't lose a battle in his whole life, full stop, let alone in the name of Allah. So, at all of these battles, although Khalid ibn Waleed had the promise of Rasulullah ﷺ that he was going to keep winning, that he was able to, and the cap was something of strength to him. And because of his deep iman, his belief in the words of Rasulullah ﷺ, he was able to gain strength always from that. Although that was the case, there's one more important thing, and I didn't mention some of these statements, but we can look at these later. There was something in the resolve of the Muslims. There was something which separated from the Persians, from the Arabs, the Mushrikeen, from the apostates when they turned back, from the Christians, from the Arabs, from the Romans. There's something that separated them all together. And that was their deep iman, in that they were fighting for the sake of the deen. They were fighting for the sake of the truth. And whereas all of the others were fighting for some objective in the dunya, and they had no strength of iman. They had no determination based upon an understanding or a deep-seated belief in Islam. And one of the things at all of these battles that was often said, they would recite many ayahs, but one of the ayahs would often be recited the night before or at the beginning in the morning of the battle was the ayah of Surah Al-Baqarah. قَالَ الَّذِينَ يَظُنُّونَ أَنَّهُمْ مُلَاقُو اللَّهِ. He said, the ones who will think they are about to meet their Lord. And the ones who think they're about to meet their Lord are the ones who are fearful and conscious that now I'm about to die. Now I'm going out, I'm about to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كَمْ مِنْ فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةٍ كَثِيرًا بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ. How many times did a small army or a small group defeat a large group with the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or with the permission of Allah? وَاللَّهُ مَعَ الصَّابِرِينَ. And Allah is with the sabirin. Allah is with the ones who stand steadfast. And this is the secret. And every time the Muslims were humiliated, is because they did not stand steadfast. They did not stay on the truth. They were humiliated every time they turned back from the battle, or they were not willing to take on the fight, or they became afraid of the numbers, or the apparent strength, or the military might, or the supporters, or the imagined strength of the enemy. But every time the Muslims stood firm, and they relied solely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to gain their victory, then with Allah's help they always did gain their victory. For they were the ones standing with the truth, and Allah would not let His sword be broken on the battlefield. أقول قول هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين.